It's a perfect day. We have got the money man, Gary Sasse, in the house. Gary is able to actually show up, have a conversation. We may agree to disagree, but at the end of the day, we'll move forward with some economic policies. Unlike our friends up at the State House, who he said, she said, he said, she said, he said, complete, shall we call it leadership chaos?
Well, never have so few fought so hard for so little, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
No, there are structural issues there, and I kind of understand where the speaker's coming from, having worked on a number of budgets. The budget process in Rhode Island, like most other states, starts in the House. That's why it's called the People's House.
Yep.
And the budget that the House votes for is not something that just the House knows about.
Right.
It's a negotiated document. So there is plenty of time for a governor, if they have the governor involved in the negotiations, sometimes they don't, and the Senate, which they certainly have involved in negotiations, to point out their concerns and differences before it's passed. You have to do business that way, or the budget becomes a worse political football than it is. And so I wasn't there. The speaker says he had an agreement from the Senate President's Senate. I don't know if he did or he didn't, but he says he did. The only proof you have is that the thing come blown out of the Senate Finance Committee, after 13 seconds of debate.
Yeah, that's right. With a ringing endorsement of the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, who is hand-selected by the president of the Senate.
And so while, you sit around and you look at the bigger picture and you scratch your head and say, to grow up, their process is a factor in a political equation. And if I was Speaker, I would fight like hell for the integrity of the House and the budget process. Now, whether that's the case or not the case, I think that's the other side of the picture that has to be understood. That doesn't give anybody any more comfort that we don't look like the back end of a jackass on how this process is going forward, but that's what's happening.
So let's stay on the politics of it for a couple minutes, then we'll get into the substance and the implications across the board. But on the big P, little p side of things, this is a real lack of leadership across the board, both by the speaker, and listen, I agree with you. If you shook hands on a deal, you shook hands on a deal. He claims they shook hands on a deal, and all indications are by the process, your point, came out of Senate Finance, that there was an agreement on it. Secondly, you can't get anywhere in those places without some trust and somebody's word being their bond. But this is an embarrassment.
Well, I was more embarrassed when the budget was presented back in February than I am now. No, you and I have had this discussion before. So a recent survey comes out from Wallet Hub, which says Rhode Island's economy ranks 36th. Our economic activity ranks 40th. The Tax Foundation publishes a listing of the best and worst states for business tax climate. We rank 44th. It's driven by our unemployment costs and our property taxes. We know that. We've had a Commerce Corporation that we've been watching for a long time and saying, is this really having an impact on creating jobs that are not one-off real estate investments?
Yeah.
We have an education system, and we can talk about the community college, later on.
Sure.
Which is failing kids in the state. Those are real legitimate issues.
Yep.
Those require creative thinking, new approaches, political, get down in the mud, fighting it out for direction. So when the budget is submitted in February, and the biggest game changer in the budget is a car tax change.
Right.
And you and I are discussing the lack of strategy, where the state's going, how we compete. Maybe we ought to think about what the leadership did in January and February, and when we get off into this little kerfuffle in the hot summer days of July, put that in context.
Yeah, I mean, listen, both of us have been up there in the past. Obviously, I worked up there during the Dupree, Sunderland, Almond administrations and saw a lot of budget fights. Never saw anything like this. There were a couple good punch in the noses here and there. I think it was 92 or 93 was a bit of a mess. There's another year went after 4th of July. But nothing like this, and nothing that hung around to the absurdity.
The difference is this, because I was involved in most of those budgets and have been involved in budgets elsewhere. When it gets to a point of a stalemate, it's generally over an issue.
Yeah.
Now, the issue may be big, the issue may be small, but it's a definable issue. So on the issue during the credit union crisis was how are we going to fund it?
Right.
The issue during the pre-administration, got to be obvious partisan differences between the speaker at that time and the governor. They ended up having a very good relationship as things got worked out. So you could always define what the issue was. Here the issue is process.
Yeah.
And there's really no good reason why it gets down to a process issue this late in the session. There are going to be process differences, there are going to be political differences. Each house is going to watch out for its own priorities and benefits.
Is the governor showing a lack of leadership by sort of hiding, hoping her National Governors Association meeting? But I mean, isn't it the role of the governor to call the two legislative leaders into her office and say, let's work this out, let's get this done, we're screwing up the cities and towns? Is there a potential, I don't want to get too dark, stick with the governor, but is there a potential about bond ratings, both for the cities and towns?
Let me
and
answer
for
the
the
governor
state?
first one,
Yeah.
the governors. We don't know what the governor's doing. If the governor was going to use her office, which I think she should, you don't do it publicly. So I can't attest whether she's
Sure.
doing it privately or not. I know you don't embarrass the Senate President and Speaker, publicly. That's not going to get you very, very far. But also, when you look at the governor's legislative relationships, she wasn't really very effective with the legislature
No.
this session. So what makes you think that when they get into a family fight, that somebody from outside, the worst place to be, if two brothers are fighting and you get in the middle of that fight, you're going to get a black eye.
Yeah,
Or bloody
right.
nose or worse.
Right.
So I don't know what she's doing, and so it's hard to support or criticize. I do know it needs to be done privately. I think there are ways governors can go about this, if not directly, indirectly, by getting some wise lady or man, involved that both respect.
I just can't imagine this going on like this if Bruce Sunland was governor.
If Bruce Sunland was governor, because I work with Bruce,
Yeah.
he about 6:01 on that Friday night,
Yeah.
there had been a couple of people in his office.
Yeah, right.
and Bruce's favorite expression was, if the Russians were in South Attleboro, what would we do?
Yeah, right.
Well, now the Russians are posted in South Attleboro. Yeah, but different governors have different personalities. They have to work the system differently. But the governor is the political leader in the state, and he or she certainly has a responsibility to use what political skills they have. And I mentioned the skills important because you have to have a certain amount of political
But
wisdom.
isn't this a perfect example, though? Governors complain they don't have, it's not a strong gubernatorial constitutional structure. Here's a perfect example of where the bully pulpit works exceptionally well to be able to bring forward change. Really no movement, and it's been, we're going on 2 weeks.
And I would, matter of fact, argue that she's made it more difficult, not less difficult, because some of the initial statements that the governor made, well, I didn't get my free tuition at the community college, I'll figure out another way of doing it.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't make you a very good arbitrator of a dispute between two people. If you've been dealing with them on an issue for 6 months, all of a sudden you find out it's delayed, say, oh, screw, I'll just do it. Well, what kind of credibility do you have
Yeah.
with them to bring the sides together? So that
Right.
was a weak political move. I
Yeah,
thought.
that's a good way to get your legislative leaders, both of them united against you
Yeah.
by usurping the entire budget process. Let's talk about some of the implications. Bond ratings.
Okay, well, if anyone says they can predict what Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch are going to do, they're lying to you. But I do know this. Rhode Island has a AA credit rating,
Yeah.
which is says it's high quality
Yeah.
investment with limited risk. There are about 30 states that have better credit ratings, either
Yeah.
AAA or AA plus. But AA is a very good credit rating, very solid credit rating. And if it's managed wisely, you can get pretty good interest rates on the debt. Nothing has changed in the fundamentals. The economy is still the same.
Yeah.
The budget process, worst case, if this budget process doesn't get resolved for a few months, it doesn't change the fundamentals of the state's economy.
But Massachusetts just took a bond rating hit.
Yes. but
Couldn't
that-
have a better economy, couldn't
but
have
that
more.
was, that was because of a cash situation.
Yeah.
Now, there are two things credit rating agencies look at. They look at the rating.
Yeah.
And my sense is that for the rating to change, a budget not being adopted for a few months is not going to change the rating. The second thing rating agencies look at is something called an outlook.
Yeah.
And
right.
either a stable outlook or a negative outlook. Right now, Rhode Island has a stable outlook. I would look, if a credit rating agency got concerned about the lack of a budget, for the first thing to do, not to change the rating per se, but to change the outlook from
Yeah.
stable to negative. And so if this thing does not get resolved in a reasonable amount of time, then I wouldn't be shocked if the credit rating agencies changed our outlook from stable to negative. And that's the first step before there's something happens with the credit rating.
What about some of these cities and towns? They're less, some of them. Pawtucket's a good example. Not exactly the creme de la creme of bond ratings right now in the city of Pawtucket. They've already got a bunch of questions. They may be taking on some additional risk in this latest version of the POSOX legislation. Now you've got school aid, a significant portion of their budget, in a little bit of a topsy-turvy. How does that spell out for?
Well, there are a couple of different issues, and the first thing to recognize before I answer that directly is the cities and towns and the state, I think, are joined at the hip because there's fiscal interdependence between the communities. So there are a couple of things that can affect the cities and towns. The first is the car tax.
Yeah.
And cities and towns right now have not been getting, to my knowledge, very good direction on how to handle this because they have to send out their bills. Now, you send out your car tax bill, without many of those car tax
Sure.
change, with it, what do you do? And so there's a great deal of confusion. I don't think, the last I heard, and this I stand to be corrected, were about 5 communities sent out their tax bills assuming the cut, and 7 sent out their tax bills assuming there wouldn't be a cut. And that's
5 others are still using a Ouija board to figure it out.
27 are going to Block Island through the summer.
Yeah, that's right.
And so that's very unfair to the cities and towns. But not only the cities and towns, it's very unfair to taxpayers.
Right.
Because they can't get a good reading on what the bills would be. Now, common sense tells you there will be a car tax cut, but there are also requirements that you can't send out a tax bill not predicated on what the law is. And so that's a tough issue, and that's putting cities and towns in a very difficult and potentially a costly situation to them. The second issue is more of a cash issue.
Yeah.
Okay, so you take a city like Providence, which I read recently, said that there was about $12 million in state aid they anticipated this year that didn't get last year for
Yep.
schools. Now, all of that state aid, some people may disagree with this, but all of that state aid will be paid. The legislature, when they do approve the budget, is not going to go back on 8 years of moving to fully funding a school aid formula. So most of that money will come. That could create some cash difficulties for a community, but I think at the end of the day, they will receive that money. Now, there are some educators.
But let's talk about that for a second. The Speaker of the House has said, see you in January, right? What usually happens in January? In January, it's 6 months into a budget, and there's a supplemental budget that's goes into House Finance to make all the fixes based on what revenue is and which departments have overspent their allotments, etc. You're now going to have a situation in which revenues could continue to underperform for the state, just like they did in May. You're coming back with a budget which we would then know is underperforming. You'd still have some state departments overspending, and all this cataclysmic act is going to take place. Those cities and towns aren't going to get their money.
Well, no, it creates uncertainty. There's no question about that. You have more certainty with the budget.
You couldn't pass the budget that you know.
But as a practical matter, it'd almost have to be cataclysmic for the state not to fund the school aid. Now, what communities may be more concerned about, there may be a categorical program here and there. So I'll give an example, and I hate to give an example because may not materialize, but they've changed the way they're going to fund English for English learners, whatever it's called.
Yes, sir.
Now, yeah, so that there could be some nicks in those kinds of programs that could affect communities, but on the big corpus of the money, it would really have to be quite a crisis for them to cut back on state aid. The difficulty the communities have put in is some uncertainty, so in the back of their mind, they may raise the question that you raised, which is certainly a prudent question to raise. And then some communities may have some real cash problems, and because depends on how their tax revenues come in and when they would have received their school aid, and those cash problems could impact municipal budgets, raise costs for short-term money.
The next revenue forecasting is in November.
Yes.
So you could have a situation, revenue numbers missed by 130 something $million.
Well,
Could potentially underperform again.
well, when you look at how the revenues underperformed, and the tragedy of the numbers is not that the estimates were that far off, or that the estimates were cut so close.
Yeah.
We leave zero room
Yeah,
for error,
right.
you know.
Right.
It's like, you know, some guys going out in New Orleans on Bourbon Street, saying, you know, chasing everything. So we chase every dollar that we can. But the revenues, if you look about it, they were off by about $100 million. That's on a base of 3.7 billion. It was
Yeah.
less than, you know, about 2%. And of that 2%, a large share of it was the corporate tax. And there were changes in the format of when we collected the corporate tax, which we should have known. And it's impossible to say that our revenue forecast is going to be right at the money. It's going to be 1 or 2. A good forecast is 1 or 2% to your benefit, but it's not a bad forecast to be 2%, you know, below your estimate. That the 2% becomes a problem when you don't do the other financial planning that you should be doing.
Let's shift a little bit. Let's talk a little bit. Bobby Nardolillo, candidate for United States Senate, sent out a press release today saying that the strength of the U.S. economy is due to the fine leadership of President Trump.
Well, he's been president for, what, 6 months now?
Yeah.
Almost 6 months. The job performance for the last 6 months of Obama was better than the first 6 months of Trump. That's not to say it was not good. The market's doing well. We're all benefiting from a good market, but
employment numbers Friday were solid.
Excellent.
220,000 new
that was well
jobs.
above estimate. Yeah, the estimate was about 175,000 jobs. So the economy has continued to perform well. So I would translate it this way: Trump's done nothing to screw it up.
Russian spies are in full employment. There's not a Russian spy to be had anywhere. Healthcare. We were going to repeal it and replace it. I believe I'd read somewhere that was going to be done first thing right out of the box. I believe that. Where are we with repealing and repelling and
I think
replacing?
I think we're between a rock and a hard spot, and I think the majority party has been very dysfunctional on this issue. I don't know, but as I said,
Is the party dysfunctional or is the leadership dysfunctional? And let me add, and this is why I say this. We've talked about Susan Collins as an example. She's a moderate Republican from Maine. She represents 2 different states. One of it, Southern Maine, is very liberal. Portland area, very progressive. Northern Maine is incredibly poor and rural, as just about any place in Mississippi or West Virginia. Those folks need the existing structure, or perceive themselves to. That's a woman who, there's no chance she's going to vote for this. McConnell and others continue to say, well, we're gonna buy off some of these moderate Republicans with some other stuff.
well, that's how they got Obamacare. They bought off some Senator from Nelson. You know,
Yeah,
guys
they
who bought
did.
off their-
And most of them either didn't run or didn't get reelected,
Yeah.
by the way, that got bought off.
I think on the policy, I agree with what the Republicans want to do. I don't think that Obamacare has been successful. Politically, it looks very problematic. They'll be able to do something. So they're going to be left with 2 choices if they can't get something done. And this is why the party is acting dysfunctionally. You're going to have to compromise, and you're going to have to compromise seriously, because the worst thing that can happen politically, in my judgment, is to go back and say, for 7 years we promised to do something. You know, we got it back, and we couldn't get the bat off our shoulder. Nonetheless, strike out. We couldn't get the bat off our shoulder.
Right.
And so that's the dysfunctionality, of what's going on. They're going to have to either reach an agreement, which I see is very problematic, or they're going to have 2 choices. And the first choice is to fix Obamacare, and fix Obamacare by shoring up the markets,
Mhm.
or they're going to have to sit back and watch Obamacare literally collapse, not everywhere,
Yeah.
but in a number of states and a number of important states. So the leadership question is, I don't think the leadership's necessarily been dysfunctional. Leadership has been dysfunctional to this sense that they didn't expect to win. And so when they won, they had to start from scratch. If they had a plan in place, had expected, to win and be able to move this legislation, they might have been in a better place. But I don't see any good answer today.
They can't get a consensus in the Senate. And the Senate strategy and ideology is not in concert with the House.
Well, at a certain point, they're going to come to the realization that it's either shore up the markets, let it collapse, or do whatever we can get done. And I'm perpetually the optimist. I think if it gets down to that point, there'll be some people that will have to swallow a bit of medicine and say, let's get something done. And there are ways to get something done. For example, I could go through the 5 or 6 issues that they're discussing. Maybe you don't do away with the upper class tax increase that Obama put in on earnings, 3.8%. And you use some of those proceeds to do what a number of senators want, to expand the availability of the monies for the OPEC program.
Yeah.
Maybe you phase out the accelerated Medicaid program at a slower rate and use some of that money to subsidize those people moving into private insurance. There are ways to fix it, but you get some really ideological people there, and they say, well, that's just Obamacare light, or that's throwing my grandmother off the cliff.
Sure.
And the leadership has to structure that. I think they've done an awful job, not so much in what they're trying to do, but in explaining it. And it can't be just that we don't like Obamacare, so we're going to repeal it. They really haven't done a very good job of saying this is why Obamacare has to be repealed, because if it's not, there are going to be places that don't have insurance. The system's going to collapse. When you have a third of the country, a third of the counties in the country having access to one insurer, when you have major portions of the state,
and that's probably one of the most underreported elements of it, that many of the states really are not providing a functional health care structure.
And the other thing that's very unreported, I can give you an insurance card, but if you don't have access, it just gets folded in your wallet and stays in your back pocket. So there's a question of access, there's a question of quality access, and those issues have not been explained. But it's going to be a very bitter pill for the people that want to see Obamacare replaced if they get to a point where the only thing they can do is either shore up the existing market system, which is the Obama system, or wait for the system, not everywhere, but in a number of states, to collapse and have an emergency. And they're not that message. I don't know why. This has always frustrated me, because I've worked on that. I don't know why the political wisdom of that message doesn't become clear, that you don't have a lot of alternatives.
Yeah, right. We're in mid-July. We have an August recess coming up in a couple of weeks. What happens?
Well, it's a really going to be a logjam, because nothing's happening. They claim a lot's happening on tax reform and tax cuts, but we don't know yet. They're going to have to expand the debt ceiling. They have to get budgets done. And right now, if you look back at what's been accomplished, there have been things that have been accomplished, but not things to grab headlines.
So are we seeing a little bit of a theme right now? We've got a dysfunctional government in Rhode Island. We've got a dysfunctional government in Washington. Is there just an element of all this right now with polarization and politicalization and fake news and new news organizations and all the rest of it, that we're just, even though the economy's decent, stock market's up, unemployment is at some decent level, we can't seem to govern?
Well, if you can't seem to govern, it gets down to one word, and where's leadership?
Yeah.
And so the issue, whether it's here or whether it's in Connecticut or whether it's in at the federal level, is do we have effective leaders? It's very hard to say that Donald Trump's been an effective leader. Now, he's done some things well. I'm not the kind of person to sit here and just bash Trump, because a lot of things.
He has better weeks when he's overseas, I will say that.
Well, he I think his policy in the Middle East has been good. Last week, Mosul fell. Iraq is in trouble.
Yep.
I think his instincts on North Korea are good. I think his instincts with the West need to be improved. But you can't, and you know, government, like any other business, you really have to know the details. You have to know what's on the ground, where the weeds are, where the bodies are buried. And it's hard to be an effective leader if you can't sit down and say, you know, damn it, this is why I want this bill changed, or this is why I want this regulation changed, and this is the reason I want it changed. And be able to, you can't defend something unless you know the details.
So both Trump and Governor Raimondo have been criticized for not actually believing in much, that they actually don't ideologically have firm positions. And so it's, to your point, listen, Bruce Sunland wanted an airport. He wanted a convention center. He wanted a mall. There were things he thought, one of the ways you recharge the state's economy after the credit union was to build stuff. He was a World War II guy, saw the impact of Roosevelt's programs, and he thought you built stuff.
Well, that's a good example because President Trump, you know, campaigned on fixing
Infrastructure.
infrastructure.
We have no infrastructure bill proposed.
I don't know what our infrastructure policy is. There's a difference between having a philosophy and an ideology and moving in that direction, and then working on transactional stuff to get there. You know, Ronald Reagan would say, you know, I'll take a deal any day where I get 70%, the other guy gets 30%, because I'm coming back for the next 30%.
Right.
And we don't have that kind of leadership. The health debate is good. What would be wrong with the Republicans saying we've got 65%, but don't worry about it, we're coming back for the 35%. And that's how we got to have a welfare state. Democrats, Lyndon Johnson's a great example, but Harry Truman before him, they wanted Medicare, they wanted Medicaid. Well, it was difficult to get, so they got Hilbert to build hospitals. Like there was a whole series of steps they took where they got a little piece of the pie, and then a decade later, they had the whole cake.
Right. Let's talk about where we are right now in the state of Rhode Island. We're a little over a year away from some significant elections, and where do you think Rhode Island is and where Rhode Islanders are?
Well, all I can do is talk from some polling data that we have, which is not that current. But the last time we asked the question, which is about 3 or 4 months ago, do you think the state's headed in the right direction? About 39% of the people felt it was headed in the right direction. And for the whole time Gina's been in, that number's been between 30 and 40%. Her numbers may be a little bit higher. So I'd say that we have a very divided state. You know, probably more than half think we're headed in the wrong direction. Some people think that we're making progress and being go in the right direction. But there's an anxiety. People don't see their lives being significantly impacted by government. And so when we give tax credits to build 4 hotels or 3 office buildings, some guy sitting out in Cranston said, well, you know, is Johnny or Mary, my family, are they going to be able to stay here and find good jobs, or are they going to be down in D.C. or on the West Coast? And that anxiety still exists. The other thing, and I think this is a serious part, I joke a lot about, we joke about the budget dispute, is whether people have confidence in government's ability. And when they see what I would consider relatively, there's significant problems, but they're not catastrophic problems, you know, happening for no reason, people scratch their head and say, there go the guys and gals again. They lose confidence. Republicans, there's a few that are making some noise. Do you get any sense of where they all are or where they're looking and what the issues will be? Well, no, I don't get any sense of who's making movement, who's not making movement. I get some sense on the issues. The first issue is going to be the credibility of government. The second issue is going to be the economy. I happen to believe, and I may be in a minority, that the legislature is starting to pick wind of this. Last year, or just recently, they cut $20 million out of the governor's request for primary economic development programs, because they're hearing and feeling the same things that we're.
No, I think that's absolutely true. I thought that was a big message, probably an underreported message, which was, listen, whatever we're doing isn't exactly being felt by the average person, and the legislature surgically cut it's almost $25 million out of Commerce Corporation's
And yet,
request.
the governor goes around saying, well, this is really a good budget. Well, you know, her program that she felt was so critical for free education, higher education, her main jewel in the crown, Economic Development Commerce Corporation, was cut back. Things that she, you know, did cut to try to bring balance in some of the self-service areas were restored. So I think there's an anxiety and an unease, and the election is going to be about, you know, who is going to be able to help my family, who is the most, you know, credible, who can I believe. And at the end of the day, elections get down to trust.
Yeah. I want to thank you as always. The Money Man is here. Listen, I know what you say about Fitch and Moody's and Standard & Poor's. As long as the Money Man resides in Rhode Island, I believe that there's going to be firm confidence in the ability of the state to meet all financial obligations because of the potential Money Man tax that could be implemented by the General Assembly.
There's probably somebody's thought of a tax that we hadn't, so.
I'd actually suggested to the speaker, we were chatting in front of some lobbyists, that he should tax the lobbyists. And none of the lobbyists seem to agree with my suggestion. I'm looking forward to the media tax that will probably come out next year.
If you had a media tax, you wouldn't collect a whole lot because it's declining.
Listen, thank you so
My
much.
pleasure.
As always,
Good seeing you.
enjoy the spectacular John Giorgi 10 weather.
This is great.
And hopefully by next week, we'll have some resolution in the state's budget and you know, a dozen or so bills.
No one's losing a lot of sleep over it.
No, I think the one danger, I will say this, I've heard the mutterings of, is legislators saying, I worked up there all year. I was working on an important bill, and nothing happened. And that's where I think both House and Senate leadership run a little bit of a risk of somebody else coming along and saying, well, you know, look what we just went through, I can do a little better than that.
Well, that takes time, and keep in mind,
Yep.
legislations are like trolleys. There's going to be one coming along in 5
Yeah,
months.
that's right. Thanks so
Okay,
much.
my pleasure.